Hey, folks, this is Jack Martin. I'm the virtual CMO for InsureMark. I want to welcome you to the Breakthrough Advisor podcast. This is where leading advisors across the country are coming to level up their practices in 2024. Today, I couldn't be happier to have Dr. Amy with us. Dr. Amy, how you doing?
I'm great, Jack. Thanks for having me on.
Well, welcome to the Breakthrough Advisor podcast.
Thank you.
So, catch up our audience a little bit. Who is Dr. Amy? Tell us a little bit about your journey. Yeah,
Oh, well,
I'm
that's
really
fun,
excited.
Jack.
I'm really excited to talk to you about what you're doing because I think advisors need it generally. So, let
Thank you.
and the work you did on that webinar we did on longevity was awesome. So the feedback's been terrific.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
yeah, let's start. Let introduce the audience to yourself.
Sure. Well, I have an unusual path into financial services and working with advisors. I have a PhD in social work, and my focus is in midlife and beyond, but I really talk about life transitions that people go through, which I say are the stages, changes, events that happen in our lives. And about 20 plus years ago now, Jack, I both had the opportunity to start working with advisors, but also with the clients of advisors. I do keynote speaking at client events, and um, I've gotten the chance to talk to literally thousands and thousands of clients across North America about life issues. But what happens, Jack, is every time I do a client speaking engagement, I stay till the last client leaves, and they told me all sorts of things about their advisors, good and bad, about what they didn't like about the industry. And I started to realize there was a huge opportunity to help advisors deepen their relationships with clients. So, what I started to do was a corollary event for advisors that was kind of similar to, except from the advisor standpoint. And then what would happen is advisor would come up to me after the speaking and they'd say, "Hey, that was great, but how do I say this to a client? How do I actually open this conversation?" And what happened is over time, I realized advisors needed a lot of really just support in delving into the life side of things. And then, of course, tying it back to the financial. And I ultimately developed a program called Trusted Advisor Choice that does just that and helps advisors elevate their practice by getting more comfortable with the life conversations. But it's always a business building thing, right? We're talking about things that impact surviving spouses staying with the advisor and uh, getting Gen 2 in the room and having better relationships with a less engaged spouse, but all through tying life and money together. And I can't say that, Jack, without doing that. I have to put my hands together every time I say that. That's the goal, right? Because I say that every life transition has four implications: practical, emotional, family, and financial. Obviously, the advisor's sweet spot is the financial, but clients usually live in the emotional and family and practical stuff going on. So when advisors get really good at those life conversations, they can then take clients with them to understand better the importance of financial planning and the investing and all of that.
Oh, that's a lot to unpack. So
That was a lot I threw at you.
it
See?
is, it is. We may
I
have to
think the
have you back.
podcast is over now, isn't it? I don't
It,
know.
yeah, mic drop. Here we go. So, let's start with so just to level set this notion of transition. So what we're
Yep.
talking about are things like I'm working and now I'm retired. I was married and now I'm divorced. I've been
I'm a
married for 40
caregiver.
years and my spouse passed away. I'm a
You got
caregiver.
it.
I've got kids, I've got Gen X living in my basement, so
Yes,
the whole the
all of
whole
the above.
all of those are transitions that we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. Stages, changes, events. You got it. You just named some grandparenthood, right?
So it's interesting because those also kind of overlap with the kinds of conversations that advisors want to be having, right?
Yeah.
It's those situations, those circumstances, those events, as you said, that are the spot where an advisor can make a big difference, right?
100%. There's that to me is the sweet spot. And a lot of advisors are, I mean, people become advisors because they love talking, working with the money and talking about that and helping clients. They're not always as comfortable knowing how far can I go in that life conversation? How do I actually ask these questions? And so, what I do is just make it easier for them to deepen those relationships.
So that's interesting. So when you say deepen relationships, that means, can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? So
Hmm.
what does that mean in your circumstance?
Nobody's ever asked me that. That's a very good question. Uh, to me, what it means is uh, the advisor has an opportunity to, when they kind of, breakthrough is a strong word, but get into talking about those things that matter to the hearts of clients, that there is both the opportunity, obviously, to be able to do better financial planning because it's based on what your client really needs and wants. But it also means that you've got a client for life because people stay with advisors that they feel know them as people and know them beyond their money. And that to me is really the key. Can I tell you a story about that, Jack? Because
Sure.
I love the story. So I had an advisor who went through Trusted Advisor of Choice, and she had a client come in who, unfortunately, her daughter had died unexpectedly in her 20s. And the advisor said to me, now, of course, I would have acknowledged it and said, I'm so sorry for your loss. But she said, I wouldn't have known really what to do in that situation. And she said, I felt so much more confident about having these conversations that I just said to the woman, if you'd like to talk about your daughter, I'd love to hear about her. And the client spent the session talking about her daughter and, you know, w- sharing stories. And when she left, she wrote the advisor an email and said, you have no idea how much that meant to me. Everyone's afraid to ask me about my daughter because they think it's going to upset me, but it's how I'm keeping my daughter alive. And she sent her a collage of pictures of her daughter. Now, there is no way that that client isn't a client for life and isn't going to share and refer. We know women are apt to refer more than men anyway, but that's the way, we spend a lot of time asking for referrals. What I help people do is become more referable.
So this really interesting subject. It particularly it's super timely. I don't know if it was the evolution of the practice of financial advice, or if it was COVID that was the trigger,
Mm,
but I can say 100% with 100% certainty that the directionally where advice and wealth management is going is into this EQ
mm-hmm.
space.
100%.
And so I was on a call with some friends from a large broker dealer and a research house last week, and we were talking about this concept of a trust formula. And
Mm-hmm.
so the objective in financial advice, okay, there's a lot of conversation about best interest, right? We want to make sure that our advice, our products, our recommendations are all in the client's best interest. But
Absolutely.
there's a layer below, there's a deeper, more important layer
Yes.
beyond that regulatory environment, and that is it in the client's best interest? And you've got to answer some questions before you can even get to that point. And
Right.
so the whole process of building trust, which sits at the apex of this client hierarchy of expectations. So to get there, what we were talking about in this trust formula was, there's an EQ component, and so there's active listening.
Mm-hmm.
These are funny words to talk about in terms of financial advice. I was a CFP for 3 decades, built one of the largest,
Mm,
most
yeah.
profitable branch offices at Advisor Group, and I don't remember ever talking about relationship intimacy in the
Right.
context of financial planning. But that's where we are today, talking about vulnerability and what you were just
Empathy.
describing with respect to that person who was concerned with their daughter and the advisor and the self-awareness and so the transparency that's going on there really drives towards that trust relationship.
$100.
Of course, things like, reliability, do you do what you say you're going to do? Are you
Yeah.
leaning into what I'm looking for? And of course, you've got to have competency and credibility and all those kinds of things. But it's super interesting to me to hear you talking about, how advisors are seeking you out to help them bridge this gap. So talk. about
There's a
that.
study, Jack, that you just triggered. Now, you may have seen this because you've almost used the components of it, and I can't remember who did it, but I can send you the reference if you want to share it with your audience. But it looked at trust from it was clients saying what created trust for them within the advisory relationship, and it was ethical was one aspect of it. The other was, and I can't remember the term they gave for it, but it was you know how to do your job. And then the third was emotional trust. And ethical trust was, I think, 17%, and functional was I think they called it functional 33, and the remainder 53%, it ended up being 53% was the emotional, whatever those numbers were. And people said, well, how can that be? Well, because it's table stakes that people expect you're going to be ethical and know how to do your job. The thing that you have the most ability to move the needle on in your relationship is the emotional side of it, and empathy and understanding your clients.
100%. And the what's interesting is so this kind of goes full circle, right? I mean, um, advisors for the last few years have been struggling to grow. Okay. And so if you peel back the layers of the onion and look at why they aren't growing, one of the things you discover is they're trying to be all things to all people. And
Yeah.
so if you're trying to be all things to all people, it's kind of hard to understand all of those people's individual needs at scale, right? And so really what we've learned is that there's
Right.
riches in the niches is what a good friend of mine says. And so
I love
it,
that.
the smaller your audience, the more intimate your relationship is with them, the better you
Yes.
understand them, the more personal the communication is, and the better understanding you have of their particular professional and financial circumstances, as well as that emotional component.
I've done workshops, Jack, where there's one I do on the family and relationship issues around estate planning. I've had numerous times clients tell me that they have a child with a lifelong disability and they've never told their advisor. Like
Jeez.
that is almost unimaginable to me. I mean, how could that advisor not know that and be doing planning with the client, right? So that people say, "Oh, I do know my client," but actually, there's another study that I do a workshop called "The Art of Deepening Relationships," which has the elements you said about listening and how to ask different questions and empathy. And I use a couple of these as a setup, these studies, and one of them looks at they ask the advisor and that same advisor's client some questions about, does your advisor do such and such? And the advisor thinks they know their client, and when you look at what the client says, there's a gap. So what I say is we just need to close the gap. And here's the beauty of it, Jack. It's not that hard to close this gap. And it really isn't. It's just it's some tweaks because advisors already are good at relationships. They wouldn't be doing what they're doing. It's just how do you take it to the next level in very practical ways?
This whole thing about the next level it really is the gateway here. Okay.
Hmm.
So our good friend Julia Littlechild runs an engagement research and engagement company. And so what she has found is that if you're really engaged with your clients, they give you referrals. Okay. And so she says, all
Absolutely.
right, look at your client list from last year. How many of those clients sent you at least one referral?
Right.
And if they didn't, then by definition, you're not really engaged with them. So how do you get to be engaged with them? It goes beyond send me your tax return and here's your asset
Right.
allocation and here's your Monte Carlo simulation for when you can retire. It goes much deeper than that, right? It's understanding what's happening in their lives, the moments that matter. I'm frankly, what you just said about not knowing about a disabled child, in my mind, is malpractice. There are
Mm.
just so many planning things that you've got to address if you've got that in a family situation. That's just shocking. But I think that what's happening with it, two things are happening with advisors. One is that they're afraid to get larger by getting smaller and getting more focused, and the other is they're afraid to be vulnerable in front of their clients. What do you think?
I agree. I think sometimes advisors are overwhelmed because they've gone so big, and that they've got too many clients in their book and it's hard to know your clients. I also think that they think it's going to take a lot of time to do this. So the two objections that I knew I had to overcome were I have no time, that's one, and I'm not a therapist, that's the other. And so I say, here's the good news. It doesn't take a lot of time. As a matter of fact, it doesn't have to take any more time than you're spending. It's just a little different conversation. And you don't have to be a therapist. You just have to be a connected human being. And you're already that. We're just going to show you a few ways to do that more effectively. And because though I hear that a lot. So it's interesting. You think they're concerned about going smaller, that if they get more focused, they're going to lose too.
Not true. I mean,
Oh, I
you
agree with you.
get
I don't think
larger
it's
by getting
true.
smaller. The more
Yeah,
laser focused you are,
absolutely.
the more you have influence and authority in
Hmm.
that particular target audience, and the better that's going to be. There's another concept that comes out of this, and it's this notion of co-creation.
Hmm.
So, particularly the next generation, whether that's Gen X or millennial, depending on where you look at it, are very much want to be engaged in the process.
Right.
They're not interested in a here's your financial planning, book in a leather bound, and go read it.
Exactly.
That's not at all where they're coming from. And
Right.
where they're coming from is, hey, I've got goals and objectives. I'm reasonably intelligent. I grew up, going to bed at night with a personal computer, so I can search out a lot of the answers you're going to give me anyway. So why don't we co-create this? So why don't
Hmm.
why don't why don't we mutually say here's what's where I need to know, am I on track for my goals? Am I
Right.
making progress? Am I off target? What are those things? I really don't need to know so much. What's my asset allocation? What's my balance sheet? That sort of
Hmm.
information. So, much more actionable plans is really where that lands, I think, and being active participants. So, what do you
You
think?
just triggered a thought for me, Jack, which is one of the things that amazes me that many advisors don't do is to ask their clients what they want in the relationship, which I bet you would say seems like it would be an obvious thing to say. So, are you the kind of client who wants to create with me, that we do this together? Are you the kind of client who just wants me to kind of do it and, get an update every so often? How much communication do you want from me and how do you want it? Well, my advisor, who hopefully won't listen to this podcast, well, is he sends me these weekly emails about things. I never read them. He's never once said to me, is that something you're interested in? Right? So I just get the blast that everybody gets, and I'm like, I'm just one of the herd. So it wouldn't take a lot to personalize with me if he asked me what I wanted, but he's never asked. And that's why I always say to advisors, what the best first question you should ask in every meeting is, what's the most important thing to you that we do here today? What's the most important thing you walk away with today?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a simple question to
Hmm.
say, so what does success look like if we do all this?
Yeah.
And understand from their perspective, what success looks like. And it's back to that notion of the customer hierarchy, right? At the peak of that hierarchy, the customer is looking for an emotional connection. That's what
Right.
our clients are looking for.
Hmm.
In 2024, they're really not interested in something they can Google. Okay,
Right.
and I like the email you get on a weekly basis. I think a bunch of what financial advisors spew out, people could Google. And if that's the case, then
Yeah.
don't send it. Do something else.
I
Um,
agree.
s- so asking questions, asking what they want, what's important to them, helping, asking them, what their concerns are, and taking advantage of the technology to be able to build, preferences like you were saying, and to use the technology to build, personalized communication plans, and
Yep.
that cadence and all of that. That's in 2024. That's so easy. It's not hard anymore. So, um,
And I can I share a skill that advisors can use right away
yes,
that can help. So this will be something that they can take away. So we all probably sat through courses on listening and read books on listening or heard something. And you mentioned active listening before. I teach listening in three levels. So level one is listening to reply. And people say, well, of course I know I shouldn't do that. You shouldn't just listen to give a response. But it's actually a professional hazard because as professionals, we want to add value. So I'm listening for how I can jump in and add value. So you're going to do that, but hold back. And then level two is listening to the content, which obviously is better. You're listening to the content so you can reply. Level three, though, is listening to understand. And I'll tell you the difference because I got to watch this in action. I was sitting in a session with an advisor and their client, and I've been working with this advisor. And the client was an older woman, a retired doctor, and her husband was not in the meeting. And this advisor clearly had a good rapport with the client. They had, nice kind of chit chat in the beginning, and the advisor knew about the kids and all the stuff you'd hope. Then they did a portfolio review. Then they did some financial planning. And at the end of the meeting is where this happened. The advisor had run a little long, and I think she was trying to wrap it up. And at that moment, as the advisor's kind of wrapping things up a little bit, the client said, I'm going to Italy to see my mom. Now, remember this client, 72 years old is how old this client was. And so I'm sitting here thinking, how old's her mom? Right? She's 72. And she didn't say, I'm going to Italy to see my mom. She said, I'm going to Italy to see my mom. And the advisor responded at level two, at the content level. And she said, have a great trip. And when you get back, let's connect and we'll talk about such and such. And I said, because they'd involved me in it, I said, how's your mom doing? And she kind of dropped her head and said, she's not doing very well. She has dementia, and I'm not sure she's going to recognize me. And I'm guessing this will be the last time I see her. And I just said, I can't imagine how hard this trip is. She said, oh, such a hard trip. That's level three listening versus level two. So it took me how long to do that? 30 seconds to have that interaction?
Yeah,
And the advisor missed it.
there are, you're absolutely right. And there are moments that matter in the client's life, and that's one of them for that particular client. I mean, at so many levels because they are experiencing longevity. I mean, they're 72, so their parents are 90 something, right? They are experiencing or looking down the tunnel at loss, okay?
Yes.
And they now have experienced firsthand the risk of cognitive impairment. And so now, if I reflect back as an advisor and I say, that's quite a gamut of emotions for that client to be dealing with. And, as we start to unpack those going forward, there are definitely things that we want to talk about with respect to goals and planning and those sorts of situations.
Longevity planning, right?
Longevity
Yeah.
planning, absolutely. How do you keep your independence? How do you what are we going to do for you with respect to, the risk of cognitive impairment and those types of things? So there's just a myriad of situations there, and so it's this tapestry. It's this beautiful tapestry,
Yes.
that if you take a minute, to pull back the drapes, okay, maybe a weak metaphor, and see what's going on, behind the curtain. It's a richer relationship. It gets you to that higher
Totally.
level of intimacy with the client. In my particular circumstance, I've got parents that are in that very similar situation. So,
Yeah.
I'm not afraid to talk about, what I'm going through in that respect. So there's a
Yep.
and
It's a
now
lot, isn't
it
it?
is. And
Yeah.
now what we've done is we're engaged, and the chances of that client ever leaving me after we have this conversation, and as long as my say do is
Yeah.
aligned coming out of that, they're never going to leave. And the great thing is, all right, so now that woman's kids are going to be the recipients
Yes.
of that. Okay, so now we zoom back out 30,000 feet. How do I do generational wealth transfer? And the answer is you got to have
Hmm.
relationships with the parents and relationships with the next generation. So, um,
And one of my favorite places to have advisors do that is, and a lot of advisors do it, with estate planning, caregiving and care planning and longevity planning is a great time to bring in Gen 2 because there's nothing but relationship building there. You're not trying to sell anything, you're not trying to push anything, and there are very easy ways to get Gen 2 in the room and part of that conversation.
Yeah, it is shocking how little they are engaged. Okay, so you talk about estate planning. So 85% of affluent families say they're going to leave an inheritance to the kids. All right,
Yeah,
37% have a plan for doing that. Okay,
exactly.
the result of that is family fights. So about a third of the fights that happen, after the parents are gone, are why did they make you executor?
Yeah, exactly.
Another
Mom
40% of
loved
the
you
fights
best,
are about
Jack.
well, there's that because she left you her favorite, sewing machine
That's
or whatever it
exactly
was.
right.
Okay. Why did, and so now
That's the
look at what's going on. This whole legacy of squabbling
yep,
and emotional turmoil that, with just a little foresight and planning, two things have happened. Take care of the parents, all
yep,
right, so they don't have chaos. And now the kids can look back and say, look what you did for mom and dad.
a
And
hundred
so
percent.
that's easiest way to get into a relationship with the next generation. So, um, wow, fascinating stuff. Uh,
I'm
so
resisting just telling you story after story, so I'm going to be quiet.
no, go ahead, dive in,
Well,
lob
that
one or
story made
one
me
more over
think
the
of
fence.
I do this estate planning workshop I said, and I hear great stories at that one. And people think the fights are around the money, but they're rarely around the money. It's often around, as you said, who got to be the executor. It's around sometimes, unfortunately, end of life decisions that were made and who got to make those. And it's often around the things that have sentimental value, but may or may not have any monetary value. But the
Right.
parents did a great will on all of the things, monetarily, but didn't think about that those possessions that
Grandma's
everybody
favorite
wanted.
ring.
That's right. And there, so I actually in the workshop get people to think about how you're going to do that. But the funny story was I have people throw out ways that they've either seen it done well or whatever. And people will say, do it ahead of time. I knew one family that used Monopoly money and had a fake auction with all their kids to make it kind of a fun thing to figure out these things. But I used to say sometimes families will use sticky notes on the back of the things that matter. People, have their name on it. And a guy came up to me afterwards and I said, that sticky note way you talked about. And I said, yeah. He said, you might want to tell people to remember sticky notes can be moved. And my sister did.
That's funny. That's funny.
I don't recommend that
Wow.
way anymore.
No, not so much. Not so much. Well, this is fabulous. Great conversation. I really enjoyed it. So, what do you want to? What thought do you want to leave with our audience?
I think the most important thought is that this again, it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but you want to increase your confidence and your competence in having the life conversations, and then always make sure you're tying it back to the financial for the client, that you're that bridge, because then all the work you do with them will have much more relevance, and people will be more bought in. And again, it's about becoming referable, not just asking for the referral, because as you said, Jack, they'll 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 refer when they're happy, they refer.
Yeah. So, one final question. So,
Sure.
before we sign off, so what are one or two things that Amy does outside of the office that would surprise people?
I'm pretty engaged in life, I would say, and I've got a kind of a new volunteer thing I'm excited about, and I'd love to plug it because other people could do it. So I travel for work quite a bit, and I'm not able to. I want to have some volunteer stuff I do, but sometimes it's challenging because it's hard to do it if you can't be on a schedule. So I've been introduced to this organization called Lasagna Love, and Lasagna Love is all about spreading kindness in communities. And people can request lasagnas and they don't have to have a long thing as to why they want it. They just can request it. And then I'm one of the volunteer lasagna makers. And you can choose how often you make lasagna and the range about how far you want to deliver them. But the beautiful thing is it's just a way to spread kindness in the community. And they're all over North America. So if you have any interest in this, and Jack, I have a really easy lasagna recipe that my friend who got me into this gave me, and it seems to be making people happy. But it's a small thing. I'm kind of on a mission to help spread kindness these days in the world. I think we could use that. So lasagna love is one of my ways to do that.
Well, that's a great one. That's a great example. I have to say, in all the podcasts and all the times I've asked that question, that's the first time I've heard about lasagna love. So
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
I've heard about skydiving, I've heard about rock climbing, but that's a first. Lasagna love. That's great. Hey, folks, we've been having a great conversation with Dr. Amy. You can reach her at
Just Amy. Yep.
dramy.life.
dramy.life or email me at amy@dramy.life.
Gotcha. Very cool. Hey, thank you very much.
Thanks,
It's
Jack.
been
I
a great
appreciate
conversation. I
it.
really enjoyed it.
You
Hey,
too.
folks, this has been the Breakthrough Advisor podcast. Thank you very much for checking it out. Please like, share, subscribe, let your friends and family know. And until the next episode, good luck and good selling. Thanks.